Welcome. We're beginning Likkutei Sichot Volume 1 for Parashat Vayeitzei, which is the Torah reading for the week of, what is it now? It's November 26th or 27th. You have to keep 27th. Okay. So what we're going to do first is just read through the Sichot in English, and then we'll spend the rest of the week discussing its points, and hopefully we'll be finished with it by Tuesday or Wednesday. Then we can maybe make up some things that we didn't get a chance to do before. Okay, this week's parsha begins with the pasuk Vayeitzei Yaakov mi Be'er Sheva vayelech Haran, and Yaakov left Be'er Sheva and went to Haran. Rashi points out that this pasuk, this verse, is repeating what was already stated at the end of the previous parsha, at the end of the previous Torah portion of Toldos. It is well known that each letter in the Torah serves a specific purpose, and that there is nothing extra written. If the Torah found it necessary to repeat the story of Yaakov leaving Be'er Sheva and heading towards Haran, there is certainly a lesson to be learned from the repetition that can be applied at all times and all places. So the Torah gives two reasons as to why the city of Be'er Sheva was given this name. The first reason is that the name Be'er Sheva is derived from the Shvuah, the oath, the vow that Avram and Avimelech, the king of the Philistines, made there. They swore that there would always be peace among their descendants. The second reason is that the name represents the seventh well that was dug after this oath was made, by Avram, of course. From both these reasons, it is quite evident that Be'er Sheva was a place that represented peace and tranquility. It would be sort of like a modern day Mecca. Mecca was supposed to be the place where they made peace or something like that. So everybody came there, and it was agreed that nobody would bring weapons in. And it was a place that was dedicated to peace between people. By the way, I heard a wonderful explanation of why was Avram so into digging wells. What was this whole thing? So, beautiful explanation comes from Zivi Ritchie, who always has these insights. He said, Ritchie, you know him. You've seen him a few times. Anyway. Professor Ritchie's son. It doesn't matter.
Who?
Doesn't matter.
Never heard of it.
In any case.
Jewish?
Yeah. He says that Avram was always interested in there being trade, because he knew that trade is what brings peace to the world. We see that we've talked a lot about the fact that he coined the first minted coins that had a picture of someone on them, which basically ensures that the weight that the coin is supposed to have in the precious metal is the weight that it has. So why did he do that? It says, over lasocher, so that merchants could have an easy time buying and selling without having to waste so much time on bartering. You could decide on an amount. But we didn't stress that it was about mischar, about there being trade. And so Avraham, set up his hotel, if you want, his inn for travelers on the main trade route of the Middle East. Be'er Sheva at the time was where two very important trade routes met. What were they? It was the route from north to south, from Turkey, Asia Minor, to Saudi Arabia and to India, and from Egypt to Saudi Arabia and India and Mongolia and China, wherever the people were traveling at the time. So those were two very, very important routes that met on this one location in Be'er Sheva. Be'er Sheva was like a very, very important place.
Center of the world.
Now, the Philistines were always troublemakers for everyone, not just for people. Don't understand this. So the same problem that we have with the Palestinians today is exactly the problem that the ancient world had with the Philistines. And the problem was that they derailed anything that could be good. They found a way to derail it. They weren't against something in particular. They were just against there being anything. Whatever it was working, they found a way to derail it. So their main thing was they invaded the coastal area of Eretz Yisrael, of the land of Israel, and then they pushed in further and further. Gerar, which was where their capital was, where Avimelech used to live, apparently, that Avimelech. It could be that there were many Avimelechs. They could have had many tribal kings, not just one. So it's already like 5 kilometers from Be'er Sheva. And the reason that they set up their capital there, I mean, again, it's a tribal capital. You can't think of something like a big city, but it was a tribal capital, was that the water that ends up in Beersheba comes from a riverbank that's right near it called the River of Gerar. That's where they were. And what they did was they made sure they closed all the wells that Avram had dug. What did Avram do? He dug wells to ensure that when people came, they had free water. That was his deal. He was interested in promoting trade because he knew that trade brings peace to the world. It makes people dependent on one another. They don't go to war if they need each other for trade. One of the only reasons, really, China, you could say that China and America are at odds. But the only thing that keeps it going, really, is the fact that they still trade. The reason that they don't go at each other, the reason that China doesn't try to win over Taiwan or conquer it or do whatever, is because it realizes that if it does that, its lifeblood is gone because it relies on trade. It doesn't have a good enough middle class and a good enough market for itself that would allow it to sustain itself. So the moment that you get a world that is dependent on trade, you get a world that has more peace. That's how it works. Russia now going into Ukraine is like, everybody understands, that's like only a maniac would do that. Why? Because you cut off all your trade. You cut off, the sanctions, they didn't believe that this would happen. They really thought that they could go under the cover of trade and annex Ukraine and nothing would happen because the world needs the trade. Well, what they discovered was that the world was willing to hurt itself to some degree in order to try to stop them. But trade is the lifeblood of peace. That's how you would see it. So Avram was in that place in Beersheba, and that was a place of peace and tranquility. And what the Philistines tried doing was to turn Beersheba into a place of hostility. So what Avram set up was that he made an oath with them, and he made an agreement so that as long as he was alive, they wouldn't stop the trade routes. But the moment that he died, Sitmum Plishtim, the Philistines closed these wells. And Yitzchak, who wasn't very big on fighting or anything like that, but he had to take a very strong stance, and he had to reopen these wells. But still, Beersheba, because they had this vow, was supposed to be a very peaceful, tranquil place. And Yaakov left this peaceful place and made his way to Haran, which the rabbis tell us represented the anger of the world. Haran signified difficulties and struggles, and Yaakov had to overcome countless obstacles in order to maintain his moral standards there and continue to live the proper life he had chosen. So it's a very interesting thing that the place that Avram came from, Haran, which is where he and his family stopped on their way to the land of Canaan, from Ur Kasdim, from Ur. Basically, it's called today. It's just called the Ur. There were two Urs, and they're also on the map. But almost all archaeologists are only aware of one Ur. So on their way, they went through the whole Fertile Crescent, as it's called, up the Euphrates and down the Jordan. So they stopped in Haran, which is today in northern Syria, southern Turkey. And that place was considered to be a very hostile place. It wasn't very tranquil. Why? Because apparently it was also a very important trade route. It was also a very important place. And that was where people were cheating each other. And what Avram tried to do was he set up a fair place, that was Beersheba, where people could count both on the money they were receiving, they made the trade easier, and allowed for people to not so worry about getting robbed, about getting killed. And that was basically what Avram set up. People think, he just had some kind of inn. Avram was known as a warrior, was known as a king. He made sure that in his environs, people had the security they needed to conduct business. That was a very big deal for him. A Jewish person can make the following observation. Hashem gave us a Torah which permeates every aspect of our life. Wherever a person turns, there is either a mitzvah to perform and a vera to stay away from. It would only seem fair that Hashem should remove the worldly struggles and distractions that may interfere with the focus one requires in order to fulfill these obligations. We should not have to suffer through the pains of exile, the struggle to make money, or other similar difficulties. Furthermore, we should be completely removed from the physical world and be able to entirely immerse ourselves in the service of Hashem in a manner that is easily accessible. Meaning, you would think that godliness is spirituality. Right? If you think that godliness is spirituality, what do you assume? That if I want to reach a high level, I should be free of the material aspect of life. Right? But where does the mistake start? That somebody says that godliness equals spirituality. That's not true. God is both the material and the spiritual equally, and He's equally neither of them, because He's beyond the material and the spiritual. But He's not more spiritual than He is material. That's like a basic mistake that is, for lack of anything better to blame, it comes from the world religions that associate, that understood from the Jews that God is there, He's up there, which means spiritual. But that's not what we meant. God is just as much material, and He's neither of them also. So the moment you take away that assumption, why would you not have to deal with the material? On the contrary, and just as much as there are spiritual struggles, right? There are spiritual struggles because there's an avera to stay away from, and you have to conquer your evil inclination. There are physical struggles that you have to go through. Because the physical struggles, what are you doing with the physical struggles? The physical struggle is elevating the sparks, is finding the godliness within the material. If you can't find godliness within the material, you only have half a conception of what godliness is. Okay? In any case, this is why the Torah, so that doesn't happen. Because you're serving Hashem, you don't get to forget about the material side. You don't get to not have disease. You don't get to not have tiredness. You don't have to not make a living. You have to do all these things because that is part of what it means to find God in this world. This is why the Torah makes a point of repeating the manner in which Yaakov went about building the Jewish nation in its purest form. It was specifically Yaakov who established it with all of his children following the ways of Hashem, while Avram and Yitzchak each had a son who rejected the path their fathers had chosen, Yishmael and Esav. So, because Yaakov is going to be building the Jewish people, in order to accomplish this task of establishing a Jewish nation, Yaakov needed to leave the comfort of Beersheba and the yeshiva of Shem and Aver, and to overcome the struggles that Haran presented. Again, he doesn't say here why, we're just explaining why. Because otherwise, you only have half a conception of what it means to be a godly nation. A godly nation has to have a medical system that is godly. It has to have a commerce system that is godly. It has to have what else do people have? It has to build in ways that reflect the godliness. You can't cheat, you can't swindle, the whole system has to be godly. Yaakov needed to leave the comfort. Okay. Until now, he was allowed and was even required to surround himself with the holy atmosphere of yeshiva. And yet still, how do we raise children? Till the age of 18, 19, 20, 21, 22. We try to keep them away from those struggles, but that's true about everyone in the world. We don't throw them out, although maybe everyone in the Western world. In the third world, people from the age of 6 or 7, they start working. And they have to keep themselves up, right? They have to provide for themselves. But we don't do that. In the more modern world, we have the luxury of allowing children to spend the first 2.5 decades of their life studying and learning and preparing themselves for the rest of life. So you spend 1/3 preparing, that's like going to sleep. And then 2/3 until 75, from 25 to 75, that's when you actually start working in the world. So this idea was taken from the way that Yitzchak raised Yaakov, even though he wasn't 25 when he left, right? How old was he?
62.
No, it's much more. 62 was what we talked about last. 86. So he was 86 when he left the yeshiva. But that's okay because he lived to 147, right? So it was half his life, let's say. It's a little bit less than half. However, once the time came for him to build the family that would ultimately form the Jewish nation, again, we know those numbers because we calculated them. But if somebody just reads the Torah, he doesn't think that Yaakov is 86 when he leaves the yeshiva of Shem and Aver. He thinks he's a young guy, but again, this idea comes from Torah. He needed to venture out into the world where godliness is concealed and hidden. So again, to say that godliness is not concealed and hidden in the spiritual, well, it's also a little bit, but it's more apparent. That's why people connect to it more easily. But to say that godliness is in the physical, that's a big chiddush. But really that's the way it is. It was this specifically going out and persevering in an environment that undermined and threatened the service of God that would enable Yaakov to build a foundation for the future of the Jewish nation. This is again, he doesn't say why, we just tried to explain at least one direction, that godliness is not complete if you don't persevere in the material world. This is a very relevant lesson that applies to every single Jew. It is specifically through overcoming the obstacles that make it difficult to serve Hashem that a Jew will be able to build a strong Jewish home that is full of light and warmth. Okay, so we'll end here today, and tomorrow we'll finish this Sicha, read through it, and then maybe spend another day or two discussing it. And that's our plan for this week.
Okay.
Good voch. Have a good week. 7:30. When we always start. We always want to start at 7:30. That's for sure.